This concept for the painting relates to these images I took. I was up on a plein air painting trip in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, and I was really taken by these fields of wild lupin that were growing all over the forest floor here, and thought it'd be fun to try it in oil painting. So what I'm going to show you today is kind of walk you through my process of how I start to design and build a painting. So when I'm looking for what I want to do with a design, one of the best things to do is a series of small thumbnails. Let me show you the range here. This is just a Sharpie, it's black. When we're trying to kind of get to the essence of shapes, we want to simplify them down to what I would call the purest form, and that is just a black shape against a white piece of paper. These are chart pack markers. This is a cool gray number 7. And you can see compared to the black, it's almost exactly the same value. There's a slightly lighter value. The next one here is the cool gray number 5, and you'll see the value there. Kind of gives me a nice kind of mid-gray dark. And then lastly is this cool gray number 2. So taking a look at these photos, I was struck when I was hiking to this scene of the various vistas that I was catching. At times I caught the beautiful Bighorn Mountains off in the distance, other times I did not, as seen in this. This happens a lot. During the process of looking for a painting location, you're confronted with a lot of visual stimulation. In this case, I was really drawn to the way the design of the flowers were, the way the tree shapes were. I was really intrigued by what I was seeing in this spot, but it was a little disappointed that from this perspective, I wasn't seeing the mountains that I'd seen all along the journey to this spot. A lot of my paintings deal with this idea of the journey. So I often shoot photographs as I'm walking along, either going to the site or leaving the site. Then I'll take those photo references later and do multiple combinations of different scenes to create a finished painting. So here, I'm really intrigued by this foreground. So I'm going to just do a small little thumbnail rendering here. One of the first thoughts I have when I start to divide the painting is I'm thinking of the canvas size I'm going to be working on. In this case, my final painting is going to be on the 1620. So I want my thumbnail to echo that, to correspond to that dimension. So I draw in what I consider my 4 most important lines. That's the shape of the canvas. I was really taken with the horizontal aspect of this scene, so I'm going to work on that format. That's 1620. Another thing I start to do is, my first concept is, what is the painting essentially about? And in this case, it was about the foreground wildflowers. So I want to indicate mostly the field that we see in the foreground. So I place a horizon line that's slightly above midway. That starts to divide my picture plane in two. So I'm getting 2 unique shapes here that kind of start the composition going. The next step here is I'm looking for where the focal point might fall. So my next line, I call it the 6th line, would be placing that slightly off-centered. So I get these 4 unique square shapes. What this has done already is put me into this place compositionally where I'm thinking of the design of things and not just taking it as it is, but how am I going to rearrange shapes and place them into a pleasing position on the canvas format. At this point now, I'm going to start to draw in the major compositional shapes. So I'm seeing this slanted plane here of the hillside. This helps too. I sometimes just getting a little pointer stick. In this case, it's just a little wooden stick. I can sort of place it over the photo And I'll do this on location too. And it'll give me that diagonal line that the hillside is showing me. It'll start to give you the angles we're after. So I lay that line in. That gives me a diagonal line. That's my first diagonal line in this composition. Now, just very carefully, I'm going to block in these tree shapes. And what I like to use is sometimes to enclose the shape in what I would call a box, create little box shapes. What I'm starting to do now is become more attuned to what's happening with the positive and negative shapes of the trees, and not just being influenced by the photo itself, but I'm being influenced more by the design that's happening. The design in terms of what is the space arrangement between the positive and the negative shape. And a quick and easy way to find out if there's a nice design going is to think about the uniqueness of the shapes. You know, are we seeing too many repeating shapes? Nature rarely repeats itself, so for a good landscape painting to be effective, we don't want to see a lot of repeating similar size shapes. We don't want to see a lot of similar size negative shapes as well. So this gets us really attuned to watching for those. This is also gives me an abstraction of the shapes, so I'm not so focused on what the object is, but what the design is of those objects. And I'm doing it lightly in pencil because later on I'll do what I like to call turning it into organic shape. Right now this is purely just an abstraction. Now, once I have that sort of done, I start to look now at the foreground elements that will help lead me to this area that we just talked about, the center of interest. There's beautiful lines. Again, if we go back to the idea of this pointer stick, if I look at the bottom of the shapes of things, I can see where some shapes will help guide me to the center of interest. Some do not. Now, I don't want them to be pointing in one straight direction, but I want to get some general design going. So this helps me to kind of understand some of the underlying structure. So I saw a shape doing that, a shape doing this. Here was a beautiful shape coming up this way. Another shape that kind of pointed this way. So it gives me this sort of S-curve or Z-curve pattern that leads me into the center of interest. So I'm going to follow some of the design of the flowers to lead the viewer's eye into the painting. So now I'll take this little pencil rendering and show you what I would do in terms of a dark light design. So at this point, now I have the general shapes. I'm going to take those shapes and turn them into an organic shape. There's sort of a rhythm in nature, you know, a rhythmic similarity but dissimilarity that makes it very appealing. So I'm just kind of looking at what I consider the upright planes, the dark planes of the tree shapes, and drawing them roughly in. Now let's look at the smaller shapes in the foreground. It's a good idea to combine some of the dark shapes, group them. There's a lot more visual interest that way. It helps to simplify the painting and give us just more impact. But it's this dark and light design that underlies the subject that really will give us our biggest impact. One of the best pieces of advice that I ever heard was to think of your painting as if it was a black and white photo, and what those values and shapes are doing just in terms of non-color. And we'll have a much stronger, more effective painting. And I've seen that to be true through the years. That if this part works, then adding color to that is just like adding icing to the cake. Now, one aspect that I wanted to incorporate is this idea of, when we travel through a landscape, these lines here help to lead us to the midground. We need an area to escape. The viewer wants to go beyond the trees, and so openings become very important. I consider them doorways. And then once you go through a doorway, something should be there of interest. It could be a beautiful sky, or in this case, I wanted to incorporate this idea of that distant mountain of the bighorns that I was seeing during my walk up to this spot. So I'm just going to indicate lightly this shape of a mountain off in the distance. So it gives another little piece of visual interest. So you have the foreground interesting shapes that lead us into the center of interest. But then going into the trees, and the nice arrangements of the trees give us another point of visual interest. And then another visual point of interest would be that distant mountain that we'll look at. So let's place that in there using this value marker. And you want to watch that arrangement of the negative shape now that's happening between the sky and the mountain. Try not to get it equally divided. So now I'm just going to take this number 2 marker, just indicate some of these upright planes to indicate that the lupin that are standing upright. As you can see, I'm not concerning myself at all with color. I know it's there. I know it's going to happen during the painting process, but at this stage, it's mostly about the dark and light shapes and the placement of those shapes. One thing I like to do too is I like to create some pathway to lead you in. So I saw this wonderful open little area of yellowish grass, which creates a nice lead-in line. You've got the lead-in line of the darks, but you also have this beautiful yellowish colored grass, which I'll use to lead the eye up to that center of interest. Okay, so I'm going to quickly show you another idea of a perspective, a vanishing point. These lines can almost follow some of these vanishing point lines, but by doing that, it creates a great sense of depth. So when I do the initial block in the painting, you'll see I'll add some of these lines to help me incorporate that idea of a one-point perspective and a vanishing point that it goes to. This is all these things that we are thinking about ahead of time really help the painting process to go smoothly. Once we've answered these questions here on the thumbnail stage, we can really just sort of let go and have fun with the painting itself. So spend a little time, work out a nice thumbnail design, and get that firmly planted in your mind. It's amazing how much confidence it builds in us as well. Okay, so hope that was helpful, and we'll see you at the easel.